Jesus told Peter to forgive 70 times 7. Is there a time limit to forgiveness, or is forgiveness a never-ending act? And what does it have to do with end-time prophecy? The answer will surprise you. This is a 3-part video series that considers the dialogue between Jesus and Peter, as recorded in Matthew 18:21-22. In the first video, we learned that Jesus confirmed a new standard of forgiveness to Peter that traces back to the 7th generation of Adam's firstborn line by a man named Lamech. He curiously pled the right of 70 times more than that of his great-great-great-grandfather Cain. By his own omission, Lamech declared his innocence because the fatalities that occurred in his case were accidental and not premeditated. This was not true in the case of Cain. Clearly, Lamech sought a new standard for his family in his day, and strangely, Jesus upheld that extended version in his day. But did you know that centuries earlier, the prophets applied this same 70 times 7 measure long before Jesus? Namely, they applied it to national Israel's own end-time prophetic timeline. If you have been tracking the mark of Cain in terms of his birth order, remember the firstborn holds a legal position in the Adamic family tree, you immediately realize that Daniel's 70-week prophecy curiously resembles Lamech's 70 times extension instead of the 7 times measure of Cain. That means Israel is the benefactor of this firstborn extension plan in some way. More about that later. But first, let's review the breakdown of Daniel's prophecy. Daniel's people, Israel, is allotted 70 weeks of years. At the 69th week, the Messiah is cut off, and the 70th week begins when the covenant is confirmed with the one that causes the abomination of desolation. Notice how the middle section of the breakdown is not revealed in the prophecy. This section is what scholars have come to know as the gap period. What is interesting about this gap period is that the full extent of its view can only be seen in hindsight, or after the fact, on the stage of human history. The gap period begins when the Messiah is cut off at the 69th week and ends right before 70th week begins, which is when the covenant is confirmed. It represents an unmarked time frame that was not disclosed or called out in Daniel's prophecy. Consequently, the gap was not understood by the Old Testament prophets or Jewish scholars even to this day. Oddly, Israel's prophetic timeline seems to be curiously marked by a trail of 7s just like the firstborn line of Adam. With God's 7-day creation workweek as the standard measure, so it became the benchmark given to Cain, a mark that was extended 70 times more in the 7th generation of Cain, which led us straight to Daniel's people, known as national Israel. So while Israel's timeline is publicly known by a trail of 7s that links them to a firstborn role, the gap, or unmarked time in history, speaks of a mystery timeline. What is striking is how Daniel's 70-week prophecy follows Lamech's formula that produces a product of 490 years. The 490 years represents Israel's fixed prophetic time in its uninterrupted format, which excludes the gap, or unmarked timeline. Again, that is because the gap period can only be revealed after that period is completed in human history, and that has not happened yet. We know this to be true because we all can attest to the fact that Daniel's prophecy saw the fulfillment of the 69th week, the moment Jesus Christ was cut off or crucified in history. It has now been almost 2,000 years since Christ died. 2,000 years far exceeds the likes of 7 years or 70 years or even 490 years. Therefore, through hindsight, especially today as we look all the way back to the cross of Christ, we can conclude that Israel's 70th week has not occurred yet. Their prophetic timeline has been interrupted to allow for the gap period to run its course as Jesus predicted. You see, while scholars call it a gap, Jesus called it the time of the Gentiles. Luke 21:24. This makes our present day essentially an extension of time in human history that falls in between the 69th and the 70th week of Israel's prophetic timeline. Undoubtedly, Lamech's extension model has some amazing implications. Through osmosis, we just discovered that the breakdown of the 70 weeks in Daniel's prophecy involves 2 timelines, not just one. The first concerns Israel's public timeline as a firstborn nation, and the second timeline concerns the Gentiles' nations, which is on a mystery timeline. What is not so clear at this point is how exactly did Israel get to such a firstborn status in the first place. How can they be benefactors of a supposedly New Testament concept in the Old Testament setting? To answer that question, I will give you 2 hints. The first hint, again, has to do with the firstborn position. The second hint has to do with rightly dividing. Stay tuned for the final segment in this series to find out the answer. Today's article was inspired the book entitled His Story Through His Bloodline, The Genesis Pre-Flood Prophecy of the Ages, available the his-storychannel.com.